In this video, we will be discussing single congenital abnormalities, which are malformation, disruption, and deformation. So, first single abnormality is malformation. Let me simplify it for you. This green traffic light represents normal healthy embryo, while the arrow is representing the development of normal organs and tissues. Now, malformation is due to errors occurring in the initial formation of structures, shown by red traffic light. The malformation affects the embryo, represented by blue arrowhead. I repeat, errors occurring in initial formation of structures. So, we can say that it must be due to intrinsic causes or intrinsic defect that alters the development.
Ma'am, can we say that it's a production defect?
Yes, Jimmy. You are right. So, malformation leads to abnormal structure due to error in tissue formation or development.
Ma'am, can you give an example?
Yes, sure. A failure of neural tube closure leads to Myelomeningocele. And this is an example of malformation. So, malformations are due to errors occurring in the initial formation of structures. Other examples are cleft palate or polydactyly.
Ma'am, what is polydactyly?
Well, class, polydactyly is a congenital abnormality in which an individual has extra fingers or toes. It is a relatively common condition and can affect any part of the hand or foot. There are different types of polydactyly based on the location of the extra digits and their appearance. Now, class, moving forward. Next single congenital abnormality is the deformation. This green traffic light represents normal healthy embryo, while the arrow is representing the development of normal organs and tissues. Now, structure forming normally, represented by green traffic light. Then, the extrinsic defect occurs in fetal life that will alter the structure. Now, the altered structure is represented by red arrowhead. So, we can say deformations are mechanical distortions.
So, ma'am, it means clubfoot is an example of deformation.
Yes, Jimmy. Now, let me explain how normal structure turns into clubfoot. When the structure forming normally, intrauterine force acts. As a result of the intrauterine force, one of the deformations rises, called as clubfoot.
But, ma'am, what is this, clubfoot?
Well, clubfoot is a congenital foot deformity where the foot is twisted in an abnormal position. This condition is characterized by the foot being turned inward and downward, with the sole of the foot facing upward. The affected foot may be smaller than the other foot, and the calf muscles may be underdeveloped. Clubfoot can affect one or both feet, and is usually present at birth. It can be mild or severe, and can cause difficulty walking if left untreated. But remember that deformations frequently resolve completely soon after birth. Also, remember that deformation is the alteration of shape or position of normal tissue. Class. alteration of shape or position of normal tissue. This point is very important. It will be helpful. Its importance will be explained later. Now class. Moving forward. Next single congenital abnormality is the distortions. This green traffic light represents normal healthy embryo, while the arrow is representing the development of normal organs and tissues. Just like deformation, structure will develop normally. Again, just like deformation, structure will develop normally until the extrinsic defect occurs in fetal life and growth is discontinued. Now, let's consider the example of distortion, which is when there is normally developed structure. Destructive force acts on it. That leads to limb reduction deficit. It means destructive force leads to growth discontinuation. Remember that disruption is destruction of exciting tissues.
Ma'am, events of deformation and disruption are same. Then, how can I differentiate between deformation and disruption?
Well, Jenny, consider examples of deformation and disruption. When the structure forming normally intrauterine force acts. As a result of the intrauterine force, one of the deformation rises, called as clubfoot. But the example of disruption is when there is normally developed structure. Destructive force acts on it. That leads to limb reduction deficit. It means destructive force lead to growth discontinuation. Now, observe carefully that deformation is the alteration of shape or position of normal tissue. But disruption is destruction of exciting tissues. There is a difference between alteration of position and destruction of tissues.
Oh, ma'am. That is a very sharp difference. I haven't noted.
Ma'am, can I get a comparison chart between malformation, deformation, and disruption?
Yes, George. I can make a comparison chart between malformation, deformation, and disruption, so that it would be more easy for you to understand these three terms, which are single congenital abnormalities. We have studied three categories of single congenital abnormalities. First is the abnormal formation of tissue. That leads to malformation or malformation sequence. Second is the abnormal forces on normal tissue. That leads to deformation or deformation sequence. While third is the destruction of normal tissue. That leads to disruption or disruption sequence. Class, is this enough?
No, ma'am. I need a comparison chart between malformation, deformation, and disruption, containing etiology, differences, and examples in detail.
Okay, class. Here we go. In case of malformation, etiology or causes are chromosomal, genetic, teratogenic, or unknown.
But, ma'am, what does teratogenic mean?
Well, teratogenic refers to anything that can cause malformations or abnormal development in a developing embryo or fetus. Teratogens can include drugs, chemicals, radiation, infections, or environmental factors that affect the developing fetus during pregnancy. All of these are morphogenic error, which means abnormal developmental process. So in malformation, there is developed structure, and morphogenic error leads to primary structural defect. Now, moving to example of malformation. Failure of neural tube closure leads to myelomeningocele. Myelomeningocele is a type of neural tube defect that affects the spinal cord and the surrounding tissues.
Ma'am, can I explain deformation? Which is the second type of single congenital abnormality?
Yes, sure.
Etiology of deformation can be extrinsic, such as fetal constraint.
But, do you know, what is the fetal constraint?
Yes, ma'am. Fetal constraint refers to a condition where the fetus is confined in a limited space in the uterus, which can restrict fetal movement and growth. This can occur for a variety of reasons, including an abnormally shaped uterus, multiple fetuses, or a fetus that is larger than average. Fetal constraint can result in various complications, including abnormal fetal position, low birth weight, preterm labor, and complications during delivery. Fetal constraint can also lead to positional deformities, such as clubfoot.
Yes, you are right. But, let me add, etiology of deformation can also be intrinsic, such as fetal akinesia. Fetal akinesia is a condition in which there is decreased or absent fetal movement during pregnancy. Now, George, you can continue.
So, all of these are abnormal force. It means in deformation, there is normally developed structure on which abnormal force acts. That leads to altered structure or position. Now, example of deformation is intrauterine force acting on normally developed structure. That leads to clubfoot.
Okay, class. Last type of single congenital abnormality is the disruption. Etiology or causes of disruption are vascular, compressive, or tearing. So, in case of disruption, vascular occlusion or abnormal force act on normally developed structure. That leads to tissue destruction. Mo, anyone from the class who can recall the example of disruption?
Yes, ma'am. When there are destructive forces that act on normally developed structure, destructive forces lead to limb reduction deficit, and it's the example of disruption.
Now, any three students who can summarize all we have discussed about single congenital abnormalities up till now? Yes, ma'am. First is malformation. Malformation is error in tissue formation, resulting in primary structural defect.
Second is deformation. Deformation is when on normally developed structure, force acts and causes alteration in shape or position.
Third is disruption. Disruption is destruction of previously normally developed structure when acted by force.
Yes. All of you are right. And this was all. In our next video, we will talk about multiple congenital abnormalities and their classification.
Ditch the hefty textbooks and embrace the convenience of learning on the go. Our interactive video content keeps you engaged, making learning medicine enjoyable